So let's talk a little bit about how to write questions for a survey. So first of all, there are two types of questions you can include in a survey. So there are open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. And so the open-ended questions is just, there's no response choices. It's just, a question where you can write in whatever you want to write. So these are really good for kind of questions where you don't necessarily have response choices, and maybe because you don't know enough about it, or you just kind of want a spot for like open comments, things like that. But these are also, you can use like interpretive questions so that you ask a couple of closed-ended questions, and then you have an open-ended question to say, well, if you said yes on this, and we'll explain why, or, to get more information about something. So that's kind of, they're really good to be used in combination with closed-ended questions for that. And they can provide a lot of information, which is great, but then it takes a lot of time to summarize and organize those kinds of questions and responses, particularly if you have a large sample size. Because if you have like a sample size of a few hundred people taking a survey, and you have to go in and somehow code all of the open-ended questions, it takes a long time, and especially to do it properly and to make sure you have like good what's called inter-rater reliability, which means that multiple different people can code it and they're going to get the same, or at least very close to the same coding. So it can be difficult, which is why you probably don't want too many open-ended questions in a survey, especially because not only is it difficult to code it as the researcher when you're getting the responses in, but also as the person taking the survey, so your respondents, they can be overwhelmed if there's a lot of open-ended questions, because it's much easier to click some boxes than it is to have to type out your response or say it, or however the survey is going. So if there's too many open-ended questions, that becomes overwhelming. And so you only want to use them where it makes sense to use them, where you're actually going to gain relevant information, and where you can't use a closed-ended question, and where and you're going to want to minimize the use of them for both the respondents and for the benefit of the researchers as well. But then closed-ended questions, these are used a lot more commonly. They're the explicit response choices, so it'd be things like yes or no questions, or multiple choice question, or put yourself in a box kind of question. What age category do you fall in, and you tick a box. So things like that. Those are closed-ended questions, and the great thing about this is that it makes things like coding and using the information that you get in as the researcher way, way, way easier. And it reduces that ambiguity, because if somebody responds in an open-ended kind of fashion, you have to try to make sure you're understanding what they're trying to say, especially if it's written and they don't have the best writing skills. That can cause extra problems. So if it's just response choices, there's like no ambiguity. But then the problem is, because there are only the choices available, if a respondent feels like they don't fit into one of those categories. So if it's like a question that's asking them about how they feel about something, and they're like, well, I guess that's kind of right, but that's not what I would say. So then you're limiting what information they can provide to you. So that can be a problem too, because then you're not really getting what they think and what they truly believe. You're getting, well, what's the closest thing out of the options available. So there's good and bad to both open-ended and closed-ended, and that's why you want to use them in like a judicious way as to what information you really need and what you want to get out of your respondents. So in general, no matter what kind of questions you're using, you want them to be clear and meaningful in order to maximize measurement validity. So you want to be able to make sure that they can't be misinterpreted, especially if they're expected to take the survey on their own, like through an online survey or something like that. You want to make sure that it's clear what you're asking and that they can't misinterpret it. And also you want it to be meaningful, in the sense that you need to ask the question. You don't want to be asking questions that you don't need to ask, because that's a waste of everybody's time. You want to also avoid confusing phrasing, and you don't want to be vague. You want to be as specific as possible while also not writing too much. So you have to weigh that as well. But make sure that anything that's written, just simple things like good grammar, you want a clear language. Don't use jargon. Don't use, big words where you don't need to. Simplify it as much as possible. It's also good to include a reference period. So if you're asking somebody to go back and remember something from their past, if it's a time period that you can provide a reference period for, this is like, if we're asking about something in the 90s, well, in the 90s, here's what was happening around this time that we're asking you about, or there was this big event that happened, and so around that time, what did you, so including a reference period can really be a good way to solidify somebody's mind into the time period that you're asking them about. You also want to avoid negatives and double negatives. So a negative would be something like, do you think prison penalties should not be increased? So what you're asking them is that, so you want to know if they think prison penalties should be increased, but the way you ask the question, if you say should not be increased, and if they say yes, it means they think it should stay the same and not go up. So it's kind of a confusing way to ask that question. And a double negative is even worse, and that's why I've got the picture here of the guy going like, oh, what? Because it would be something like, do you disagree that sex offenders should not be designated as dangerous offenders? And so for that question, if you think they should be dangerous offenders, you would actually say yes to that statement. So it's very confusing. And so you want to avoid that type of language. You want to make things as clear as possible. Something else you want to avoid is what's called a double-barreled question. And a double-barreled question is when you're actually, within one question, you're actually asking two questions. So, for example, if you say, should we stop spending so much money on increased sentences and spend more on restorative justice approaches? That's actually two questions. You're asking them, well, should we spend less on increasing sentences and should we spend more on restorative justice approaches? And they might agree with one of those and not the other. They might be like, oh, well, yeah, we definitely shouldn't be spending so much on sentencing, but I don't want to put any money into RJ. So then they don't know how to answer that question, because then they're just going to say, well, no to the whole thing, even though they did agree with part of it. So double-barreled questions you want to avoid as well, because you want to make sure you're getting the information about each point that you're asking about. And if you combine it, then yeah, you're reducing the number of questions you have to ask, but then you're getting less information. So double-barreled questions you want to avoid as well. And then you want to avoid making one side or the other a disagreeable thing to do. Because we have what's called socially desirable responding. And when somebody is and everybody experiences this, anybody who's taking any kind of a survey or an interview or anything like that, we get this socially desirable responding, where we don't want to say something that is going to make other people think bad of us. So we don't want people to think that, oh, that we're stupid or we're bad people or anything. So socially desirable responding is when we sort of shift our answers to try to look good to the interviewer. And this can happen even if there is no interviewer, even if it's an online survey, it can still happen because you're like, oh, well, even if it's not totally the truth, I'm going to shift my response so I feel better about my answer. So you got to be careful about that. So when you're asking a question that might have this kind of social desirable response, you want to sort of make the question seem like either answer is fine. So people often want to answer the way they think you want them to answer, or answer in a way that seems less antagonistic or more in agreement with most people. But if you write the question so that it's not clear what most people would think, then you're letting them answer anyway without having to worry about that social desirable responding. And socially desirable responding is a problem for any kind of any situation where you're asking somebody a question. So in surveys, but also like intensive interviews, even in surveys that go along with experiments, anytime somebody is talking to another person virtually or in face-to-face or whatever, there's that socially desirable response that we feel. And some people feel it more than others, and but it's something you got to be aware of. So some sort of just additional guidelines for specifically fixed response questions, the closed-ended questions. The response choices, they need to be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So everybody fits somewhere, but only one place. So it's exhaustive, meaning that everybody can fit somewhere, but mutually exclusive means you can only fit into one category. If somebody can fit into multiple categories, and it's not like a check all that apply kind of situation, then you're going to have to make them choose when they actually fit in more than one spot. So you want mutually exclusive and exhaustive. Likert type scales are really good for a lot of the questions, especially asking about how somebody feels about something, or if they agree with something or not. And so these are the scales that indicate the extent of agreement or disagreement with the statement. So you would make a statement, and then it's the strongly disagree, disagree, agree, agree strongly. So those are Likert scales. So those are really good, so that you're not just making them choose like yes or no. They can sort of put themselves on the scale. You also want to minimize fence sitting and floating. So fence sitting is where people are kind of neutral in their attitudes towards an issue, and they're like, I could go either way. So to minimize fence sitting, you probably want to avoid having like a middle neutral category, so that you make them have to choose a side. Although sometimes that can then be bad, because if somebody is truly neutral about something, then you're not giving them the option to choose the way they really feel. So you got to weigh that. And then you also want to minimize floating. And floating is where somebody chooses like a substantive answer even when they don't know very much about something. And they like float back and forth because they actually have no idea about what you're asking them. So sometimes it requires, maybe giving a little explanation about something you're going to be asking about, or providing like a response that's like NA or I don't know. Those kinds of responses will make it so that they don't feel like they have to respond to something that they honestly have no idea what you're asking them about. And it's also sometimes good to use filter questions, skip patterns, contingency questions. So filter questions are things like you ask a question to establish whether a concept is applicable. And so if it's not, then you use skip patterns where the questions are skipped by respondents if they're not applicable. So you have a filter question like, has this ever happened to you? And if they say no, you don't want to ask them more questions about that thing that never happened to them. But if they said yes, you're like, might want to ask, when, and what happened, and whatever. So filter questions are that beginning question that will determine whether it's relevant or not. And then the skip pattern is like, whether we skip all these questions or we go into them depending on your original answer. And the contingency questions are those questions that would follow after that ask more about that initial concept. But you only want to ask them to the people that it would be applicable for. So something else you can do with questions is combining them into what are called indices. So, and indices, that's just the plural for index. So if you have an index or a scale, that just means you're asking a bunch of questions about, and that's how you're going to combine a bunch of questions to measure one main concept. And so then you would use reliability measures to help figure out whether the responses are consistent, because you want to make sure that they are actually all, if somebody is high on, something like impulsivity, then they're going to answer all these questions yes, let's say. So then reliability measuring will be making sure that most people that they're either answering all yes or all no. And you would use these kind of index questions because you want to make sure that you're not tying some big concept like impulsivity to one question. And if it's like one question like, would you ever want to go skydiving? And so somebody high on impulsivity probably would say yes. But if they have a fear of heights, then they're going to say no, even though in general they're actually really impulsive. So that's why indices are really good, because then you can ask a bunch of different questions and see how they respond overall. And so this is because the single questions are prone not only to that it might not apply, but there's also this thing called idiosyncratic variation, which means that the responses may vary because there might be a reaction to a particular word or a particular idea. And so if they have like a kind of feeling towards some word that you used, or it brings up a memory for them or something, then they may respond a certain way to a particular question, but in general, they would still answer like in the affirmative for that overall idea. So tying a whole concept to one single question can be problematic. You can also use weighting, and this is where you would weight particular questions more than others when you calculate the index. So if it's something is seen as more important or more indicative of that concept that you're trying to measure, then it's going to be kind of worth more on the overall scale. So for example, the static 99, which is used to estimate the risk of recidivism for sex offenders, it weights previous sex convictions as more important than age or marital status. So they're all important, but previous sex convictions are more important for that. So that's kind of what weighting means. But you got to be careful, because questions, if you have each component question, you want to make sure that it's actually measuring the same concept and that you haven't combined them in a way that doesn't make sense. Combining responses to specific questions can also obscure important differences in meanings amongst the questions. So just by combining them, you might be missing out on differences between, and questions in an index may cluster together in subsets, which means you don't want to combine them all. You might want to combine separate versions. And that's how sort of some important things about writing questions.